At 30 below, with the wind screaming across the frozen fjords of northern Norway, 32,000 NATO troops are currently engaged in live fire drills, the ultimate test of endurance and coordination. While tanks grind through ice and soldiers push past breaking points in a visible demonstration of unified deterrence directed at Moscow, a fundamentally different strategic move was executed in private. This action, quiet and deliberate, creates a fracture in the very alliance those troops are shivering to protect, signaling a profound shift in the geopolitical landscape. Good evening, and this is a detailed look at strategy, fracture, and the quiet rise of a new kind of global partnership. Overnight, without warning, and without a single moment of debate, President Donald Trump unilaterally lifted key sanctions on Russian oil. This is not a staff error or a failure in communication. It is a calculated decision that stands in direct opposition to 6 G7 nations that all forcefully said no. Mr. Trump sat in that G7 meeting and listened to every single allied leader deliver explicit warnings against giving Russia economic breathing room. While Ukraine bleeds into the 5th year of a war that has killed hundreds of thousands, the British Prime Minister presented specific intelligence, the French President detailed battlefield momentum, and the German Chancellor, just hours after visiting that exact Arctic base in Norway, argued that lifting sanctions now would be a direct gift to the Kremlin. The president nodded, demonstrating that he heard them, and then hours later in the dark, did the exact opposite. What that sequence reveals is a deliberate and visible crack in the heart of the Western alliance, moving the conflict from a policy disagreement to a fundamental question of strategic trust. The immediate reaction was as explosive as it was entirely predictable. The German Chancellor, standing right next to Canada's Prime Minister at the Arctic base, took the notable step of publicly slamming the move with zero diplomatic sugarcoating. That rare display of near-unanimous unity from 6 G7 nations who routinely disagree on trade, defense budgets, and climate policy highlights the gravity of this singular U.S. break. For Mr. Trump, this pattern is not unexpected. It is the same playbook that saw America move alone on tariffs, question Arctic sovereignty in Greenland, and create uncertainty over Ukraine support. What this consistent behavior suggests is that it can no longer be dismissed as mere unpredictability, but must be understood as a deliberate strategy. This strategy is one where the United States does not just lead from a different position, but moves forward entirely alone, prioritizing unilateral action over consultation, alignment, or accountability. For an observer, it forces a direct and uncomfortable question. How many times can key allies be blindsided before the central person at the decision-making table is no longer trusted? That is the real fracture in Norway, an invisible fault line that mainstream coverage is currently failing to explain. Because while headlines scream about division and European fury, something else entirely happened in that same frozen corner of the Arctic. While the alliance publicly fractured, Canada did not react with panic or rhetoric. It adapted and positioned itself in a way that suggests a different, more calculated future. This new reality requires a direct pivot to the economic front, where the numbers tell a story that media narratives are currently obscuring. The headline that hit like a hammer was undeniable. 84,000 jobs lost in Canada a single month. February 2026. This is the figure every mainstream news outlet used to build a narrative of economic collapse and a system under overwhelming pressure. On camera in Norway, a journalist pressed Prime Minister Carney with a sharp, direct question that most politicians would struggle to deflect without spin. Yet Carney did not flinch, dodge, or raise his voice. He calmly presented the verifiable data, and, with that evidence, completely flipped the script. While that single-month figure is correct, the underlying trend is that over the last 6 months, Canada has added over 80,000 net jobs, verified by Statistics Canada. Then came the comparison that no economic model had properly integrated. The United States, an economy 11 times larger, added just 6,000 jobs in that same 6-month period. That structural contrast became even more surgical when focusing on that same brutal month of February. While Canada lost 84,000 jobs, the U.S. economy did not just struggle to add positions. It lost 92,000 jobs in the same period, a figure that, when adjusted for economic scale, points to a significantly more acute adjustment. Suddenly, that 84,000 figure does not read as a symptom of collapse, but as a notable correction within a much broader and more durable job creation trend. What that data demonstrates is a country that is absorbing shocks, recalibrating its system, and repositioning itself, a detail that was almost entirely buried in mainstream reporting. The logic of Canada's repositioning is not happening in a vacuum. It is explicitly about the map, particularly a map of the Arctic that few people truly see or understand. Canada is not just a secondary partner sitting on the northern border of the United States. It controls 40% of its own massive landmass and 75% of the total Arctic coastline. And here is the detail that reframes every single defense calculation. Canada shares a 3,000-kilometer Arctic boundary directly with Europe, a geographical link connecting North America straight to the European Union's security architecture. When Mr. Trump talks about Canada as if it were simply the 51st state, or questions whether it can even defend its own north, he is not just poking a neighbor, he is destabilizing a critical, shared NATO frontier. That reality, far from the cameras, is what Germany's chancellor and leaders from Norway and 13 other nations understood when they prioritized that Arctic base visit. That shared line of defense in the high north is not symbolic. It is the physical front line of a new Cold War, and Europe recognizes its vulnerability without Canadian alignment. This shared strategic interest explains a subsequent and almost entirely ignored economic defense decision. While Washington moves on its own path, Canada quietly but deliberately executed structural deals that secure its own independence. Carney signed off on a $40 billion submarine program for 12 new vessels, with the final bids narrowed down to German and South Korean companies, with extensive Norwegian involvement. The critical detail to observe is that the United States is not just on the sidelines of this procurement. It was not even invited to the table. That is not an oversight. It is a calculated choice by the Canadian government. When a Norwegian journalist pressed with the uncomfortable but necessary question of whether the United States can still be trusted in the North, Carney's multi-part response revealed everything. He began with a standard affirmative, then deliberately corrected himself, stating that Canada is no longer waiting and is actively expanding its partnerships with the Nordic and Baltic states. This leads to the question that is now being whispered in defense ministries, but not yet fully vocalized in Washington. Can these two distinct, competing strategic realities coexist? On one side is NORAD, the aerospace and defense command that has been the seamless backbone of North American security for over 60 years, a system defined by integrated control and deep trust. That partnership, built on 60 years of operational history, is still in place, still watching the skies together, and remains functionally critical for both nations. Yet right alongside it is a different architecture, being built piece by piece, marked by tens of billions in Canadian spending on its own capabilities and deep integration with partners that are not the United States. This new coalition, connecting Ottawa, Berlin, Oslo, Seoul, and Tokyo, is not being built against America. It is being meticulously constructed without any need for America. For the entire post-war era, the strategic calculation for any medium power was simple. Security and trade stability can only be guaranteed by aligning with Washington, and there was no other real option. Now, multiple alternatives are emerging simultaneously. In that private G7 meeting, Mr. Trump chose a new kind of unilateral American path, opting to walk that line alone and leaving allies to react to a decision they were explicitly told was dangerous. In Norway, Canada made its own clear public choice on camera, standing with the other 6 to reject that unilateral path. European capitals are already recalibrating, and Asian allies are watching that sequence with intense focus, evaluating the new geometry of global power. For Canada, the long-term strategic path is now visibly clear, but fraught with operational complexity. It means investing massive resources in its own Arctic defense, while simultaneously managing a trade relationship with its larger neighbor that is increasingly defining itself through conflict and competition. It forces the question, is Canada building a durable alternative alliance network, Or is it quietly preparing for a world where it will eventually have to stand entirely alone? The initial clash of strategies in that frozen Arctic base established a distinct tension between traditional North American integration and a rapidly accelerating European pivot. While headlines focused on the dramatic diplomatic rupture of 6 G7 nations standing firmly against one, the true architecture of this geopolitical shift is visible in the hard economic data, structural defense procurements, and calculated statements from the key actors involved. That sequence is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement by a mid-sized power systematically insulating itself from an increasingly unpredictable neighbor. The primary battleground for this quiet realignment is the structural divergence in how both nations handle economic shoe, CKs. On June 2, 2026, Statistics Canada confirmed that the country had entered a technical recession, reporting 2 consecutive quarters of annualized GDP contraction, including a 1.0% drop in the final quarter of 2025 and an additional 0.1% decline in the first quarter of 2026. This data would typically signal a government on the defensive, yet the composition of that decline reveals a deliberate strategy rather than an uncontrolled collapse. The contraction was heavily driven by intentional policy choices, specifically sharp reductions in federal government spending and a planned slowdown in immigration levels designed to ease housing and infrastructure bottlenecks. What that framework does structurally is redirect the gravity of Canadian economic planning away from chasing raw population growth, focusing instead on capital-intensive productivity. The strategic implication is clear. Ottawa is intentionally cooling its domestic market to build a more stable, higher wage base that can withstand the mounting pressure of arbitrary U.S. trade actions. iPolitics Issue 1. The political framing of this economic data is where the strategic intent becomes entirely visible to outside observers. Emerging from a cabinet meeting in Ottawa to address the recession figures, Prime Minister Mark Carney did not offer a standard political evasion, stating directly, "As we do all that, the data is going to be uneven. We see some weakness, in part because of clear decisions by the government." What that response reveals is a deliberate choice not to close a door, but to explicitly own the economic deceleration as a necessary phase of a broader structural transformation. By characterizing the recession as the predictable outcome of state-directed structural adjustments, the administration is preparing the electorate for a prolonged period of economic friction. This approach signals to international markets that Canada is actively decoupling its long-term growth strategy from the immediate consumption patterns of the North American market. The forward-looking implication is a permanent shift toward high-value sectors, particularly the critical minerals and clean energy assets that European and Asian supply chains are scrambling to secure. CBC This domestic economic tightening is being precisely synchronized with massive, non-U.S. integrated defense commitments in the High North. The center of gravity for this sovereign defensive posture is the newly accelerated $40 billion Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, which seeks to procure 12 conventionally powered, ocean-going submarines capable of under-ice operations. By narrowing the final consideration exclusively to bids from TKMS of Germany and Hanwha Ocean of South Korea, Ottawa has structurally excluded the American defense industrial base from its most consequential naval procurement in a generation. That exclusion is a calculated reaction to the reality that the United States no longer manufactures conventional diesel-electric submarines, forcing Canada to integrate its maritime intelligence directly with European and Indo-Pacific technology. What this framework does structurally is redirect the gravity of Canadian defense spending away from U.S. defense giants, embedding Ottawa maritime security into the industrial lifelines of alternative global powers. This ensures that, regardless of the political trajectory in Washington, Canada retains the independent capability to police its own 3,000-kilometer Arctic maritime border with the European Union. The financial scale of this defense pivot is matched by a parallel infrastructure campaign designed to permanently anchor European security assets in the Canadian Arctic. Simultaneously with the submarine announcement, Ottawa finalized a $35 billion capital allocation plan dedicated exclusively to high north infrastructure, including deepwater port upgrades in Nunavut and advanced early warning sensor arrays across the Northwest Passage. This infrastructure is being designed to meet the exact operational specifications required by NATO's European commands, allowing German, Norwegian, and British assets to seamlessly deploy to the Canadian Arctic without requiring Pentagon mediation. That design choice is a direct policy statement aimed at reducing the historical Canadian reliance on U.S. Northern Command infrastructure for baseline continental defense. The strategic implication is the emergence of a dual-track security architecture in North America, where Canada maintains its formal NORAD obligations with Washington while constructing an entirely independent, European-facing defensive wall in the high north. This dual architecture ensures that if a future U.S. administration executes a sudden withdrawal from traditional NATO commitments, the Arctic frontier remains structurally fortified. This systemic pivot is not confined to defense procurement. It is reshaping the flow of strategic commodities, specifically through the newly formed G7 Critical Minerals Alliance. Formed in mid-June 2026 during the summit in Evian-les-Bains, France, this alliance binds Canada, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea into a closed-loop supply chain for the extraction and processing of lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements. By establishing strict environmental and sourcing standards, this framework effectively bars subsidized or politically volatile actors from dominating the supply chain, while subtly creating a high-standard trade zone that operates independently of Washington's unilateral tariff frameworks. For Canada, which holds the world's most extensive unexploited reserves of these specific materials, this alliance transforms its natural resources into geopolitical leverage. What that framework does structurally is redirect the gravity of Canadian resource exports away from the United States, linking Ottawa's economic survival directly to the industrial survival of the European and Asian advanced manufacturing sectors. The long-term implication is a permanent realignment of North American trade dynamics, where the physical movement of critical goods increasingly bypasses the American market entirely. The World Economic Forum, the true intent of this multi-layered strategy, is now converging on a singular, highly volatile variable that will ultimately dictate the success of this geopolitical decoupling. All eyes are now fixed on the upcoming October 2026 NATO Defense Ministers session in Brussels, where Canada is scheduled to formally present its independent Arctic Maritime Command structure to the alliance. That specific event will force an unprecedented diplomatic showdown, as Washington must decide whether to officially recognize a European integrated defensive command on the North American continent, or reject it and risk permanently fracturing the structural framework of transatlantic security. Synthesizing these strategic layers reveals that the individual maneuvers described in the High North and the boardrooms of Evian are not isolated reactions to a single U.S. presidency. They are the initial, highly coordinated movements of a broader structural decoupling, where middle powers are actively building parallel security and trade architectures to insulate themselves from great power volatility. What that pattern demonstrates is that the traditional single-anchor Western alliance structure is being replaced by a system of overlapping issue-specific coalitions that no longer depend on a guarantee from Washington for Canada. This shift represents a fundamental transition from an era of passive integration to one of deliberate strategic autonomy, forcing the country to bear the immediate domestic costs of its independence. Accepting a technical recession and intentionally cooling the domestic economy to correct systemic vulnerabilities is the economic price Ottawa is willing to pay to establish a more resilient, self-sustaining foundation. By structurally embedding its defense procurement with European and Indo-Pacific partners and locking its vast critical mineral reserves into closed-loop allied supply chains, Canada is effectively diversifying its geopolitical risk. The forward-looking implication is that Ottawa is permanently reducing its exposure to unilateral U.S. economic and security pressures, ensuring that its long-term survival is anchored across multiple global centers of power. For the United States, this quiet alignment signals a subtle but profound erosion of its traditional continental hegemony and its undisputed veto power over North American security architecture. By moving unilaterally on sanctions and trade, Washington has accelerated a process where its closest neighbors and allies no longer view American alignment as an unassailable guarantee, but as a variable to be managed. The structural exclusion of the U.S. defense industrial base from Canada's multi-billion-dollar submarine program is a direct consequence of this shift, demonstrating that unilateralism carries real, measurable costs for American industrial influence. This development suggests that while the United States remains the most dominant military and economic power on the planet, it is increasingly operating in a hemisphere where its allies are learning to build critical infrastructure completely without its input. For Europe and the broader global alliance network, this systemic recalibration offers a viable template for navigating an era of fractured great power relations. By integrating deeply with Canada's Arctic maritime defense and securing prioritized access to its strategic resource base, the European Union is successfully extending its own strategic depth directly into the Western Hemisphere. This horizontal integration between middle powers creates a powerful counterweight to great power unilateralism, demonstrating that collective resilience can effectively substitute for a single, unpredictable superpower protector. The long-term implication is a more fragmented, but inherently more stable global order, where security and trade stability are maintained through a lattice of overlapping, high-standard partnerships rather than a single point of failure. The single most important takeaway from this entire geopolitical sequence is that the traditional rules-based international order is not simply dissolving. It is being actively and systematically reconstructed from the middle out. Middle powers like Canada are no longer waiting for great powers to provide global public goods or maintain structural stability. They are leveraging their own natural resources, geographical positions, and industrial capabilities to build their own fortresses. That transition marks the definitive end of the post-war architecture where all strategic roads led directly through Washington, replacing it with a multipolar reality defined by variable geometry and self-directed sovereignty. Ultimately, that structural shift is a permanent change in the physics of global power, and the upcoming ministerial decisions in Brussels will merely confirm an alignment that has already been forged in the Arctic cold. That is the new geometry of international relations, and the board has already been permanently rearranged.